On today's show,
a powerful story can be truthful and still have an impact. We're so busy trying to spin whatever narrative we want to tell or whatever narrative in traditional media spaces that the moneyed interests or the owners of the publication want to tell, that we get lost in crafting a narrative rather than relying on narratives to tell the truth. I think it's really up to newsrooms to invest in that work to make sure that they are telling truthful stories, because at the end of the day, that is our job. We are not novelists. We are not poets. We're not prose writers. We are in the business of telling facts as they are. And every other traditional media outlet can move as far away from that as they want. The Appeal will always stay committed to rooting our work in facts.
Hello, and welcome to the second season of Beyond the Box, the social justice podcast that goes beyond the headlines and typical stories. We like to ask challenging and incisive questions that help us to get to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of important issues. I'm your host, I am your co-host now, Doug Lasden, founder and executive director of the Urban Justice Center. And I am especially excited to introduce our new co-host, Johnny Perez. I know Johnny from his time at the UJC, where he distinguished himself as smart, thoughtful, and I would like to add, even wise. He is multi-talented and brings a variety of experience, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from him. I'm also glad to thank our guest, Molly Greene, for taking time today to join us. Molly is the director of The Appeal. The Appeal has a long history of writing important and thoughtful articles around issues of social justice. In these difficult times when we are fighting for hearts and minds, Molly is doing vital work, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say. I want to now turn it over to Johnny so he can introduce himself and get us going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doug. And Molly, thank you so much for being here. As Doug mentioned, my name is Johnny Perez, and I will be your co-host for this season. I'm super excited to be here. Today, I work for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture as their Director of U.S. Prison Programs, where I work with faith leaders and people who experience solitary confinement like myself to change laws and policies around it. Doug, as you mentioned, about 11 years ago when I was released from prison, the Urban Justice Center, specifically the Mental Health Project, was one of the first places that opened up their doors and saw my lived experience as an asset, and here it is 12 years later. Today, we work with about 12 different states to advance legislation and changing prison conditions and be able to bring this, not only my own experience, but also the experience of advocates and leaders throughout the country working on different issues. With that said, I want to welcome Molly. Molly, I want to pass it over to you to just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what's driving you, a little bit about the work that you do as a journalist over at The Appeal, and anything else that you think you want to add on before we kind of jump into some questions. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you both. I'm very excited to be here. As Doug and Johnny said, I'm Molly Greene. I'm the director at The Appeal, where we focus on exposing harm, educating the public, and elevating solutions coming out of communities most impacted by the criminal legal system. So we report on all aspects of the criminal legal system, from what drives criminalization and incarceration to the way people are treated in jails and prisons, to what it looks like trying to get pardoned or paroled or get probation, and what that experience is. I come from a background in law and democracy. I'm a longtime organizer, advocate, attorney who's worked on issues across the board, everything from governmental ethics to repro rights to criminal justice. And I have always focused my work on disrupting powerful systems that cause harm to people. Through especially my work as an organizer and advocate, have always had a really keen understanding of the role that media plays, both in telling stories and the stories that they're not telling, but also in lifting up work that's being done on the ground. An advocate or an organizer can only knock on so many doors, but media has the ability to reach thousands of people instantaneously, especially with an online newsroom like ours is. And so that was really a driving force for wanting to pivot to working more in journalism. And especially at The Appeal, I'm driven mostly by the impacts that we make. And you can talk more about that as we go along in this conversation, but that's really what matters, is the people that we can help along the way.
I want to say thank you for that, Molly. I think not only the work that the Appeal is doing, but I think the role of journalists in terms of informing the public with facts and, making folks aware about what's happening around them is like critical. Very recently, I think that there's been public discourse around just doing away with fact checking, at least on some social media platforms where many people get their information from. And it feels like this, like truth is losing its centrality, of course, if in public discourse. So one of the things I'm always curious about, and from your perspective as a journalist at the Appeal, how do you see your role in pushing back against this trend that's moved away from fact checking, et cetera? Any reactions to that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that we work in a field where facts are very important because getting facts wrong or sharing misinformation isn't just bad for how people understand things. It actually negatively impacts people's lives. If we get facts wrong about something that happened in prison, we're looking at fear of retaliation against our sources and against our writers. We're looking at lawsuits from the Department of Corrections. And so we work in a space where not getting your facts right can cost people their lives and their jobs. I think there's also a really false dichotomy that's been created where you either can tell the truth or you can tell a good story. And I think a big part of what we do at the Appeal is thread the needle between those two things. I think that a powerful story can be truthful and still have an impact. We're so busy trying to spin whatever narrative we want to tell or whatever narrative in traditional media spaces that the moneyed interests or the owners of the publication want to tell, that we get lost in crafting a narrative rather than relying on narratives to tell the truth. That's where the Appeal really shines, is that we are elevating new stories. We're elevating stories traditionally left out of media, and we're elevating them in a very truthful way just by shifting who we're relying on to tell that truth. I also would be remiss not to mention my colleague, Ethan Corey. We are very lucky to have the best fact checker in the business. We have him on staff. We have him fact checking in addition to 80 other jobs that he does on a daily basis, but he could not possibly be more thorough and accurate. And so I think it's really up to newsrooms to invest in that work to make sure that they are telling truthful stories, because at the end of the day, that is our job. We are not novelists. We are not poets, we're not prose writers. We are in the business of telling facts as they are. And every other traditional media outlet can move as far away from that as they want. The Appeal will always stay committed to rooting our work in facts.
I have a related question. You put out these stories with good facts and good policy discussions. I'm frustrated, and I wonder how you deal with it, that when you put out these very sensible stories talking about reality, and then you have these very powerful, often moneyed interests who have a different policy goal, and they come in and sort of bull their way into impacting policy. And I'm also talking about politicians who have an interest in making society seem more dangerous than it is in order to get votes. And you have private prisons who have an interest in prisoners. That's their product. They have a lot of power, and you put out these great stories and you're just often steamrolled. And how do you deal with it? I'm sure it makes you frustrated. I'm not going to ask, how does that make you feel? I'm sure it makes you feel frustrated, but can you comment about that? Or what do you think of it? What do you do about it?
Yeah. At the heart of it is an issue that all advocates and organizers deal with, which is that like any fight towards progress is a very long road, and it is constantly one step forward, three-quarters of a step back kind of work. That is the work that we're committed to doing. And so like the real answer is we take the wins when we get them, and we get a lot of wins. Our work has made an incredible impact in terms of informing politicians, informing policymakers, informing with people with the power to make change of issues that they should be paying attention to in their community, whether that's state legislators or US congressmen and women and people. Our work has spurred federal investigations. Our work has spurred like really active engagement by state legislators. In Arizona, a story that we've been following for a few years inspired a state legislator to put forth legislation to change the state's felony murder laws, which is something that very few people actually know even exists. When you tell people that people can be put in prison for a crime that they didn't commit, their minds are blown. And so,
For long sentences and serious crimes, murder.
yeah, and often as juveniles, as young people, even juvenile, I think is a very sterile word, as teenagers.
Yeah.
We really try to stay focused on the wins that we do have, and they're not losses, but not let the steamrolling get us down. And as we all know, stomping your feet and screaming that things aren't fair or that's not true doesn't really get you very far. And so telling powerful stories that counter harmful narratives is where we have found much more impact. We focus on telling the stories that need to be told and telling the stories that need to be told specifically to counter a lot of that steamrolling narrative we see, and get really excited when that makes an impact.
I guess you're saying in some sense that's why we do what we do.
Yeah.
If people were to just pay attention to policy, it wouldn't need the work of the three of us. And that's the challenge. And
right.
There's a long history of the arc of freedom and the arc of justice. And yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think, ideally we would all be out of jobs because we could do our work and people would be like, oh, yeah, you're right. And we're going to change all these policies and make everything better for everybody. But there are people who have been fighting these fights much longer than me. We will keep fighting them till the end of time. And if we all just kind of threw our hands up and gave up because we felt like we were losing, we would get nowhere. A lot of it is just, stay the course and, like I said, celebrate the wins.
I talked to a lot of people on the ground who have just generally just grew a general distrust for traditional media. Their stories have actually been used to push policies that they potentially wouldn't, agree with. So I'm thinking about one, trust building with folks in a world where folks are increasingly becoming more distrustful of traditional media. And then two, how do we reach those that are not listening to us in some ways? I almost kind of answer my own question, but just thinking about those who are not tapped into the traditional forms of media, how are we reaching them? Because it feels like, there's the policy war, then it's like the narrative war, which media is deep in. So
I think we're at a place where it's very hard to reach people in general. I think attention spans are very short. There's a general distrust of news. But I also think that there is some benefit for organizations like The Appeal in that, because I think that we are at a place where maybe not people entirely outside of our echo chamber, but people who are distrustful of mainstream media are seeking out alternate places to get their news. And so we think a lot about our audience. We think a lot about who we're trying to reach. And that includes everybody from, like I said, people who have the power to make change, people who don't have access to news. We work with a lot of incarcerated writers. We tell a lot of stories about people in jails and prisons. We always make a really concerted effort to make sure those stories reach the people that either wrote them or were sources or were mentioned in them. I also think a lot about people like my mom, who is a very forward and progressive thinker and has not thought a lot about the criminal justice system. The reality is that there are 1.9 million people in jails and prisons. Over 50% of the country has a relative that's either formerly or currently incarcerated or has been formerly incarcerated themselves. But that leaves the other 49%, 50% who aren't affected by it on a day-to-day basis. And people are pretty bad at paying attention to things that don't affect their own lives in some way. And so, if we have people in the general public who are seeking out a new form of news because they don't trust the mainstream media, and The Appeal is where they're learning about the criminal legal system, that's a best case scenario for us, because that means that they're getting our stories. They're listening to the narratives from our incarcerated writers. They're learning about how the private prison industrial complex works and the ways that people are profiting off of people in prison trying to talk to their family members on the phone in ways that they would not otherwise be paying attention. And so we do really try to actively seek out people who are either deeply, deeply engaged in our work or people who are, forward thinking, progressive thinking people. The criminal legal system exists primarily on a local level. Everybody's community has at least a jail, if not a prison. They have elected officials who have the power to really harm people's lives. And so that's really where we focus our energy. Again, really like on the people who are paying attention and are seeking an opportunity to get a different source of news.
What about the people who do not see themselves as progressive or are not progressive, or for lack of a better term, who are voting for Donald Trump? Are you seeking out to get to them, or are you really just speaking to the people who you think you can reach and will be impacted by what you're saying?
A little bit of both. I think that criminal justice is a unique space where there does tend to be more sort of bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. But I think that that's where, we do all sorts of different storytelling. We publish long form investigations, we publish breaking news, we publish reported pieces, and we publish a lot of personal narratives. And I think personal narratives in particular go a really far way to reaching people that otherwise wouldn't agree. Because again, when people hear somebody's individual story of what they've been through or what they've experienced, and Johnny said it best at the beginning, if we look at lived experience as an asset, it is extremely powerful. And so we do have former law enforcement reaching out. We have former police officers and sheriffs who are really reliable sources who are helping expose a lot of the harms that they've seen and they've experienced in their jobs before. And so are we reaching the most staunch Donald Trump supporters?
That's great.
Maybe not.
I'm sorry to have said Donald Trump, but there is a group, though, that no matter what the reality is, wants to see a tougher law enforcement, more jail time, and whether that's Donald Trump supporters or not is not really relevant, but they come out in droves to vote, and then that impacts policy. And I'm frustrated when I hear that, especially when it's not true. Mm-hmm. When in New York, we're the safest we've been in decades, if not longer. And yet people go, oh my God, the crime is out of control in New York.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump is a supporter of that narrative. I'm frustrated by those people not having better information. How do we get to them to correct the misinformation that feeds something in them that wants to have they want to get out there and be tougher on crime, and they are true believers? They're often just wrong, and it has a pernicious effect in so many ways. More prisons, less programs.
Yeah, I'm curious about Molly's response, but I'll say, we can't assume that more information will also equal compassion. On social media, you can put a picture or video or something like that, folks, you just can't deny it. Things that are just undeniable, and folks still will vote for a specific policy despite the fact of having information. So that's also equally frustrating when people have the information and still vote against their interests. So, but I'm curious to Molly's reaction to both of that.
I mean, first of all, if we're talking about a general return to tough on crime rhetoric, there is almost no mainstream politician who is immune from buying into that. It is certainly not just the Donald Trump voters of the world who are voting for increased law enforcement, increased jail and prison time. A lot of it based on facts that aren't really facts. And I think a lot of my answer goes back to the same conversation we just had, which is that it is incredibly frustrating. And to Johnny's point, it is not a straightforward line between if you give them the information, they will change their minds and they will vote differently. It is so much deeper than that. We need to invite some social scientists and psychologists to engage in this conversation too about, how do you effectively change people's minds, or why can't you change people's minds no matter what you put in front of them? And I think a lot of the answer is you have to stay the course. You have to make a concerted effort. Our newsletter reaches an incredible number of people who don't otherwise open the news. We have a lot of readers where all they do is read our newsletter every week. And our newsletter often tends to be more commentary and narrative, not always, but they are really powerful stories that at least make people pause for a moment. And I think, again, if you take the general public who have never thought about these issues or have only thought about them to the extent that they are people who benefit from feeling safer when there are police around, which is a very small and increasingly smaller population of people, if a story about somebody else's different experience can resonate with them for a moment and make them pause, it might not make them vote differently this time. But if you can kind of keep weaseling yourself in and keep over time sharing those stories, I think all change is slower than we ever want it to be. But I think it is, you just have to stay the course. And fortunately, we have good colleagues who we can rant and rave to when we are particularly frustrated. And a lot of times that's where our breaking news stories come in. When we see the San Francisco Chronicle publish 4 stories about how shoplifting is a big problem in the city, we know we have to get in there and explain that this is not actually the case. This is not what the data is saying. This is not what the facts are saying. And hope it hits home with some people.
Molly, can you give an example of, let's say, like an investigative journalistic piece, that really had an impact that you were particularly proud about that you want to highlight? I think it's really good for our listeners and potential viewers to be able to see this in practice.
I mentioned it earlier, but the reporting that we did in Arizona really saw impact across the board. So this was a story about a kid who was 19 at the time and his friends who was killed by police officers, and his 3 friends were sent to prison on felony murder charges. The appeal measures impact in 4 main ways. We look at individual impact, have we helped people get released from jail and prison? Have we helped people get the health care they need? Have we helped people get legal support that they need? We look at community impact. Have we galvanized communities or helped lift up work on the ground being done? We look at institutional impact. Are we changing policy? Are we getting powerful people on board to pay attention to the work that we're doing and the work that we're highlighting? And then we look at narrative impact. Are we changing media narratives about the story that we're telling, the issue that we're covering? And so this story really hit across the board. We were able to help these kids get legal support that had sort of fallen off. Their cases were reopened. It spurred 2 different community coalitions that have since joined forces, got the whole community to pay attention to this specific case and advocate for these teenagers, advocate for their family members and the father of the kid who was killed. It got the attention of the state legislator who really has been working on felony murder in the state. And we co-published with a local outlet. So we also got to tell a really different story than people in Phoenix were used to seeing out of their local paper. And so that story, we continue to follow that story. We continue to keep our readers updated on it. Again, like I mentioned, it's even outside of Arizona, it brought so many eyes to not only police killing, but felony murder in general. And it has been really incredible to see. I think the other place where it's not one particular story, but we've done really consistent reporting on jails and prisons in Georgia. And that also has gotten Senator Ossoff's attention. There's been FBI investigations. It's really gotten powerful people invested in looking at conditions in Georgia jails and prisons. So those are a couple examples. I think, but for the most part, everything that we publish makes some sort of impact, but there are those few in particular that really kind of where we see impact across the board.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I would like to add that people should definitely go, if you haven't already, go to the Appeal website, sign up to get their newsletter. They're obviously doing impactful, important, interesting work. And I want to thank Molly, and I also want to thank Johnny for joining me. It really does add a lot. And so this is our first effort together. And we hope you like our episodes. Look at our other episodes, listen to our other episodes, and stick with us. Anything else, Molly or Johnny, you want to close out?
No, just really want to thank, Molly, the work that you're doing over at the Appeal and the entire team over at the Appeal. I think the work, to be able to spread the truth, and have checks and balances on the stories that are really happening is really important and critical in the coming years. So I think that's important, and just really want to look forward to, more of these conversations with you, Doug, as a co-host and beyond. So thank you again.
I'm going to add one more thing for Molly. when you go to the site, look for the donate button. I'm sure they're donating, and I'm sure the more money they get, the more good work they do. And she did not ask me to say this. I'm saying it because I'm so impressed, and they need to be doing more of what they're doing.
That was going to be my pitch. Please support the Appeal. We need all the funding we can get, but also support independent journalism, support nonprofit news. It's a space that's really struggling. Newsrooms are closing left and right. When they close, they don't come back. Support criminal justice organizations like the Urban Justice Center and like the work that Johnny's doing. Also a space that's really struggling for funding. You know, we see this return to tough on crime rhetoric and everybody thinks that this work isn't important anymore. It's always been important. It will always be important. So please, with whatever you have, whether it's $1 or $1 million, go out and support the organizations that are doing the work that you care about.
Thank you very much.
This was very fun. Thank you both.
Tune in next time where we actually interview former San Francisco DA Chesa Boudin, but also a leader in the fight for human rights.
Please make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app, and please rate us 5 stars on the Apple Podcast. And finally, please pass this episode on to your friends. Thank you for your support.